And then Jeremiah, at the same period of time, was in Jerusalem. He was prophesying there in Jerusalem. In fact, Jeremiah was prophesying about the time that Assyria was, in its demise. And he was warning the people about their corruption and God's judgment to come. And then Nebuchadnezzar made at least three raids, major raids on Jerusalem. Took some of the captives away each time. But Jeremiah was left in Jerusalem. And he, of course, tried to work with the people that were left in Jerusalem. They didn't just take all those people back. And then eventually, as he stayed there in Jerusalem, and the captives, most of them were there in Babylon, he tried to keep peace in Jerusalem. And eventually, where did he end up? Eventually, where did Jeremiah end up? Jerusalem. He stayed there in Jerusalem. But what happened there after one of the kings of Israel rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar took him away, and then there were still some left, and where did some of the remnants of the people that were left in Jerusalem, where'd they go? They went down to Egypt. This is a complicated, obviously, world affairs are, at any generation, any era, world affairs are very complicated. But it was really complicated there in that era. But the primary message of Isaiah is not really about Jerusalem being taken captive and then some of the remnant returning. The real message of Jesus, or the real message of Isaiah, was about Jesus. It was about the Christ. It was about God's eternal plan. And that's what chapter 53 really focuses on. And so we begin with verse 4 this week. And here, surely he has borne our griefs. Now, there's just no question about to whom this references. There's just no question about that. Let's go back to verse 3 and pick up on that. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. We hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Now, in verse 4, surely he hath borne our griefs. What's the focus of verse 4? Focus of the first three verses was Christ, the Messiah. What's the focus of this? Beginning with verse 4, what's the focus there?
Our sins.
Huh?
Our sins.
But what's the focus of that? What's the focus of those verses?
Christ died for the sins that we made and the grief that we took.
The focus is man, isn't it?
Hey, Bill, I find it interesting that he's talking about something in the future, and he's speaking in the past tense.
That's what prophecy is, isn't it? Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did not esteem him stricken. Or we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. For he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. And with his stripes we are healed. So what seems to be the focus of this?
Crucifixion
Okay?
for us.
The focus is mankind. Now, think about that for just a moment here. The race of Adam, the human race, was in a hopeless condition after Adam's sin. Is that right? The human race was in a hopeless situation at the time of Noah. Is that right? The human race was in a hopeless situation at the time Abraham was called. Right? The human race was in a hopeless situation at the time of the Babylonian captivity. And so we could just conclude that mankind was in a hopeless situation. And so, in God's eternal plan, what did he do? And think about this during the week to come. And maybe you've been thinking about it all along. But what did God do to remedy this hopeless situation? In terms of God's justice, how could he extricate mankind from this hopeless situation?
Sacrifice.
Pardon me?
Sacrifice.
There had to be a sacrifice, but the blood of bulls and goats couldn't do it, right? There had to be a perfect what? A perfect sacrifice. And so there was only one way that God could remedy this situation of the hopelessness of mankind, and what was it? That was for him to enter into the human family. Now think about, academically we can recite all this stuff, and that sort of thing. But think about it. God entered the human race in the person of his Son, Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, to give hope to the race of Adam. And so as we look at this verse here, and let's repeat this, let's repeat these things that relate to our. You see, he bore our griefs, our sorrows, our transgressions, our iniquities, we are healed. We like sheep. So, these are things that we need to meditate upon. From one perspective, and maybe I've got the wrong perspective here, but the whole focus of this is us. The whole focus of this verse is us, the human race. The extrication of the human race from this bondage of sin. So he has borne our griefs, carried our sorrows. We did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Now, what's that idea? We did, and he's talking here of, you know, in a generic sense, we, the human race, the people, humanity. We esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. We did esteem him stricken, smitten of God. Smitten of God. What is that language, what does it say to us? God was punishing him. Because of us. Now, you remember when that Mel Gibson put out the Crucifixion of Christ film? How many of you saw that film? I never went to see it because
It was brutal.
Well, you know, every time Mark or somebody preaches about the intensity of suffering of Christ, it kind of hurts. I don't want to see that film. I mean, I appreciate you guys that saw it, but I don't want. It's too. It just really is bothersome. And Gibson was criticized because some of the Jewish folks and others, the folks thought, well, you're blaming the Jews for the crucifixion of Christ. Remember that? You remember that reaction? Some people what Gibson was, you're blaming the Jews for the crucifixion of Christ. Well, who else was involved in the crucifixion of Christ? The Romans. Pilate.
Yeah, but the Jews were the masterminds and the father's boys.
But
They started it.
but, was it the Jews only? No, it was the Romans. Was it the Romans and the Jews only?
He depicted that in the movie, all of that.
Yeah. But who's responsible for the crucifixion of Christ? Huh? Yeah, everybody, you see. So the people who were blaming Gibson for blaming the Jews, that really isn't an issue. It's mankind. It's the human race. It's us. He has borne our griefs. But back to that idea. He carried our sorrows. We understand that. Our griefs, our sicknesses, our sin sicknesses. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God. What do those two short phrases? What does that say to us? There's an idea out there that, and always has been out there, that if you're in a great state of suffering, it may be because why? You've been really bad, right? And God is punishing you. I remember an uncle of mine who was at a very young age, relatively speaking, and he was a great person. He suffered a terrible illness, and he said, kind of in just kind of throwing up his hands, so to speak, what have I done to deserve all this? Isn't that the way people kind of feel? Jesus and his disciples encountered a blind man, and they asked Jesus what they asked. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he's deserved that? So there was I suppose there were a lot of people thought, well, here, Jesus suffered all this humiliation, all this torture and so forth, and died on the cross. You know, they probably thought, well, God is striking him. He's stricken of God. So that's kind of what... Don brings up Job and his three friends who said, the idea was, well, you've been a sinner. That's why you're suffering. So he, David. Would you say that a little louder?
Although he was being stricken, he had God's affection for sin and our
I think what you're saying is true, is that obviously God, in His eternal plan, mapped this thing out. And from the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, what did God say about Jesus at His baptism?
My beloved Son, I am well pleased. Hear ye him.
Right. So His whole, at the beginning and end, God was obviously pleased with him. Verse 5, but He was wounded for our transgressions, He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon Him. Now, what's that chastisement? What does that specifically reference? Chastisement.
All the trouble He went through for our redemption. All of the...
Is there anything more specific that chastisement references?
Talking about the chastisement of the Israelites, the things that they've done.
Well, is there any, that word chastisement specifically? He talks about being wounded for this and the chastisement.
King of the Jews sign above his head.
Pardon me?
Are you referring to maybe the sign, King of the Jews?
Well, not necessarily, but Kathy?
Chastisement itself just means that you're kind of scolding, you're just kind of telling somebody off, or putting them down a little bit, and putting them in their place, so to speak.
Okay. But in this context, and more specifically, it has to do with His being beaten. It has to do with the flogging that took place at the hands of the Roman soldiers. And when Pilate was dealing with Jesus, his wife came to him with a message, and what was that message? She said, I've suffered a lot in a dream. And have nothing to do with this man. Well, what she was saying, have nothing to do with what, with having this person. Righteous man, yeah, right. I'm glad you mentioned that, this righteous man. And we'll want to note this later on in our study here, but Pilate understood that he was not guilty. But this idea of the chastisement, his being whipped, being beaten, he said that the chastisement of our peace was upon him. Now, why did, when Pilate knew he was innocent, why did he have him beaten?
Here's the
And he thought that probably the Jews would have some satisfaction, then some pity upon him. And if he would have come to the conclusion, well, that's enough punishment, let him go. Could Pilate have known that this chastisement would be a part of this ordeal? Isaiah said 8 centuries ahead, before that, he talked about that chastisement. And the fact that Pilate's wife was, involved in this, I think further identifies that this prophecy was, this specific prophecy played out on the annals of history. And our peace was upon him with his stripes, again having to do with the beating. With his stripes we are healed. Now, this idea that, or this fact that our wrongdoings were part of this equation of his suffering, right? Our sins, right? So if we ever are tempted to do something wrong, what should we be thinking about? If we're ever tempted to do the wrong thing or not do the right thing, what should we be thinking about? We should be thinking about, that's the very thing that put Christ on the cross, wasn't it? The sins of not just the Jews, not just the Romans, but all humankind, you see. Just something to kind of meditate upon. And it was through now I don't know. Why in the world, why would God put his son through such an ordeal? Do you ever think about that?
I do. I often wonder why it had to be so intense and so brutal and so long. Just horrible.
Yeah. What?
One thing to die, but why do you have to be, as Jesus Christ, when his eye was swollen shut, they spit on him? Jesus Christ.
The Son of God. Humanity put Christ on the cross. Now, why? I don't know why, but nobody knows why, I guess, except to identify the terrible nature of sin.
What amazes me, this plan just didn't happen. This was planned before foundations of the earth. I mean, this is, God knew this was going to happen, and still it carried out.
And of course, Jesus knew it was going to happen.
So, I mean,
In the Garden of Gethsemane experience, he knew it was going to happen. And Don's pointing out that this is the plan from the beginning. So then Isaiah says that, and we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. Was Isaiah including himself in this pronouncement? We, I suppose, wouldn't he? We have gone astray, like sheep just wandering off, like a dumb sheep, just wandering off, not understanding the dangers of wandering away from the flock, just wandered off. We've, like sheep, dumb sheep, have gone astray. We have turned everyone his own way. What did Jeremiah say about that? 23:23. not in man that walketh to guide his steps. Or is that Jeremiah 23 or 23:10? Which is it? Megan, which is it? You've been studying Jeremiah. Luke, what is it?
I think it's 23.
Pardon me?
I might be wrong.
Well, anyway, it's in Jeremiah, the 23rd chapter, someplace. All we like sheep have gone astray, and we've turned every one to our own way. And the Lord hath laid upon him the iniquity of us all. Again, iniquity of us all, the human race, every human being that's reached the age of accountability. Verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He's brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as sheep before her shears is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Well, sheep are so unassuming. Sheep are so, what? Describe a sheep. Hey, Cole, you don't have sheep out there, do you? They're dumb. He didn't have dumb sheep. Get him some sheep out there, Mark. Okay, they just they're just oblivious. They're different than pigs. Yeah, different than other animals, right? In terms of, can you imagine holding a hog down? You city people wouldn't understand, but could you imagine holding a hog down and shearing them? Shearing a hog. What's a sheep do? Just, all right. No problem. Anybody ever shear a sheep? Oh, you city people don't know anything about that. I tried it one time and cut the poor sheep's hide, and they still just sit there. Okay, you cut my hide, but I'm okay. We're like he said that Jesus was like that metaphor of the sheep. Now, can you give some instances where Jesus opened not his mouth, didn't defend himself? Pardon me? Yeah?
In the wilderness,
Okay, but all right. In his last days, when he was on trial, or supposedly, when he was brought before the Sanhedrin, what was his reaction before the Sanhedrin? Before Pilate, before Annas and Caiaphas, the high priests, did he have any defense? Well, he just, he didn't respond. When Pilate brought him in for, to have a kind of an inquiry, what was his response there? It was kind of a no response, right? And he said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" What did he say? Thou sayest. It was just like, he didn't go in through the Hebrew scriptures and try to defend himself. He was led by as a sheep to the slaughter, as a lamb dumb before the shearers. He was taken from prison. Verse 8. He was taken from prison and from judgment. Who shall declare his generation? Now, that's an interesting statement. Who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people was he stricken. Now, when that expression, who shall declare his generation? He was taken from prison and from judgment. Start with that, taken from prison and judgment. He was taken from prison and judgment. What was Pilate's judgment? He's innocent. Pilate's judgment was taken away. How was it taken away? The Jews demanded his crucifixion. His judgment was removed. Pilate's wife said he was, and Herschel pointed it out, she said, have nothing to do with this righteous man. His judgment, the judgment of innocence was taken away. And somebody, I think David mentioned also that there's a political kind of decision. And since two of you have mentioned that, what would have happened to if there had been if the Jews, if Pilate had ultimately protected Christ, what would this mob of Jews have done?
They probably would have turned on him.
They would have lost the emperor.
They would what?
They would have lost Caesar and planted and would have been removed.
Or they would have created such a riot and an insurrection that Pilate wouldn't have been able to hold his job. Caesar recalled Pilate to Rome. What's the matter here? You can't keep peace with those Jews? But this statement, who shall declare his generation? Who shall declare his generation? What does that suggest? Who shall declare his generation? Who would... as we look back on this, what happened there, it is such a travesty. This was bad. This was horrible. Now that's one view that, as you look back and think how awful that generation of people, we think of, in the history of our country, we think of this generation, a particular generation of people was kind of religious. And then another generation was kind of secular. And then, was it Brokaw who said that, they talked about the greatest generation? What generation is the greatest generation? Well, those that have kind of are now in their very senior years, and most of them gone, the greatest generation. Well, when you look back at this situation, How would you describe that generation that crucified the Son of God? I mean, that was the generation that crucified the Son of God. Now, so that's one view of what that would signify. Another view is, and both views might be right. Another view is that this is the generation when for humanity great things started to happen. Is that right? This was a pivotal point in history where things got better. Now, this was a point in history, a pivotal point in history. Where do we get the idea of BC? Something happened 100 BC. Where do we get the idea that something happened in 1950 AD? Where do we get that division of history? We're basing history on what? This is the line of demarcation, you see. And so up till Christ, up till his death, burial, resurrection, and the establishment of his church, up until that time, God paid primary attention to whom? The Jewish nation. Right? He paid primary attention to them. Now, of course, there was, at the time of Abraham, there was Melchizedek, the king of Salem, the king and priest of Salem. God had other, ventures with mankind. But history, God's history, focused primarily on the Jews. Now, but now, where does the focus of history? What's the focus of history now? Or at that time? The New Testament church. Where is the New Testament church? In all the world, you see. All across the globe. Now the focus is to all of humanity by way of the church. And that started in that generation. That putting the God's word in, emphasis on his word going into all the world. Who hath declared our generation? For he was cut off of the land of living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. And he made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was there any deceit in his mouth. No, that idea that he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich. What is he talking about? Is Isaiah talking about there?
Crucified with 2 thieves.
Yeah, but he's talking about the graves. He made his grave with the wicked and with the rich. We understand about the rich. Why the rich there? Was that Kathy? Joseph of Arimathea was a rich dude. And he was placed in Joseph's tomb. But what about this idea of the wicked? The thieves, you mentioned the thieves, they were where? On each side of him. But the inspiration doesn't give us any indication of what happened to the bodies of the two thieves. What happened to them? Well, the Romans had the responsibility of getting rid of those bodies, burying them. And he was the wicked, the thieves, you see. They had to be buried someplace. And so there were two grave sites, one of which was the grave owned by Joseph of Arimathea, the rich guy. He was...
Before you finish the last reading, that verse you wanted, being not directly death, was Jeremiah 10.
Okay. I even had the wrong chapter. I'm dyslexic. I must be dyslexic. Had the chapters wrong. It was not 23:10 or not 23:23. It was 10:23. Thank you, Judy. Okay. I guess that's about the time for today.